Welcome! In this video on the Civil War, we will look at the campaign of 1863, as well as Union and Confederate troubles as they struggle to wage the war. General McClellan is replaced by General Ambrose E. Burnside for the Union Army of the Potomac in late 1862, after General McClellan failed to destroy Lee's army at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. The Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, was a significant enough Union victory that President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But McClellan missed a great opportunity to inflict a much more crippling blow on a trapped Confederate army. After failing to do so, he's replaced by Burnside, who led the Army of the Potomac to further south into Virginia, past Manassas, the furthest place they had advanced on the overland route, and is across the Rappahannock River from the town of Fredericksburg. But he laid there waiting weeks for the quartermaster's department to get him pontoon bridges to help cross the river. This gave General Lee's army time to entrench. And at the Battle of Fredericksburg, you see here, Burnside's men were on the far side of the river, giving Lee's army time to entrench on Mary's Heights on the far side with the far side of the town. After they crossed the river, Burnside's men charged time after time, with the bulk of their forces charging the troops at Mary's Heights, entrenched on the high ground. And much as we also learn from Star Wars, it is terrible to attack someone who has the high ground, and General Burnside found that as well. It was indeed a disaster, and Burnside, openly weeping, offered to lead one more charge, and his subordinates almost had to tackle him off his horse to discourage him from doing that, and they had to limp away in a retreat. This is, by the numbers, Lee's greatest victory, although it did not require any remarkable tactical genius on his part. It's a very lopsided victory. The Union takes 2.5 casualties for every Confederate casualty, which is incredibly lopsided. Then General Burnside leads his men around the Rappahannock to try to outflank Lee's position. The battle went so poorly, though, that Lincoln replaces General Burnside with another Union general, Joe Hooker, nicknamed Fighting Joe, who had a reputation for aggression and hard fighting. And so Hooker continues Burnside's plan to try to outflank Lee, who's entrenched at Fredericksburg on the Rappahannock River. And so he's going to move up the Rappahannock to the Rapidan River to try to outflank Lee. So here's Lee's position on Mary's Heights. They go up the Rappahannock River, and there's a fork here, the Rappahannock and the Rapidan, crosses both, and he is attempting to pull off a Robert E. Lee maneuver. This is a maneuver worthy of a great commander like Robert E. Lee, and he thinks that he's going to have Lee trapped with a chunk of his army pinning him down here, while the main force will come up and hit Lee from behind. A great plan. However, Lee will pull yet another remarkable maneuver and outflank Hooker. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, a more zoomed-in version is that Lee will leave a truly skeleton force of men just so that the Union doesn't realize he has also moved his main force over here. He also orders one of his corps, a major chunk of his army, to flank further out to the west, use this region of the wooded region of the wilderness as a screen to get all the way into the Union flank and hit their lines on the end. And the result is, as you might imagine, very bad for the Union Army, even though they were outnumbered, and Lee divides his outnumbered force twice. He's already outnumbered by the Union, and he divides his force here, and he divided his force a second time in sending Stonewall Jackson on this flank maneuver. It was, yet again, a true masterpiece, a brilliant victory by Robert E. Lee. Numerically, it doesn't show it as much, but despite being badly outnumbered, he attacks and divides his force multiple times and forces the Union Army to retreat back across the river, at a terrible cost, because during a scouting mission, Stonewall Jackson himself was killed. He had led his men, and they had pushed to this point but were unable to finish the battle. On his return from a scouting mission, which he personally led, he was actually shot by his own men, and Stonewall Jackson was killed. And he was wounded, but he died some days later, but was taken from the battlefield mortally wounded. And ultimately, in the East, in Virginia, that's the key of the 1863 battles leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee now has this remarkably invincible reputation, and he decides to take a big gamble, to maybe take Philadelphia, maybe Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, somehow cut off Washington. A frontal attack against Washington was deemed impractical because it was the most heavily fortified city in the world by this point. So he decides maybe invade the North, cut off Washington. Maybe it will distract the Union armies that are out west, and we'll pick back up with them momentarily with General Grant, who is heavily pressuring Vicksburg and threatening to cut the entire Mississippi off from the south. Lee hopes that by invading the North, maybe it'll force a surrender. Maybe it'll distract Grant, who's out west. Maybe it'll make the Union make some blunder, and he can sneak into Washington. Who knows? He maybe believes too much in his own invincibility, and he takes a big gamble to invade Pennsylvania in July of 1863. General Hooker is replaced by General Meade, and going into the Battle of Gettysburg, this is Confederate Cavalry General Jeb Stuart, who gets slightly separated from General Lee and allows Lee to get a little bit tricked into this battle situation at Gettysburg. Here we zoom in, right, here's Richmond. We saw that first battle where the Union marched out from Washington on its way to Richmond and fought a battle at Manassas. Then they spent all winter training. Then McClellan floated his army down, and they fought the 7 days battle before McClellan retreated. While McClellan was retreating, General Pope on the Union Army attacked again at Manassas and was crushed. Then in later 62, you had McClellan win barely the Battle of Antietam as Lee invaded Maryland but was pushed back at Antietam. Then McClellan is replaced by Burnside, who marches past Manassas to Fredericksburg, can't break through at Fredericksburg. Burnside is replaced by Hooker, who flanks around to Chancellorsville, but Lee double outflanks Hooker at Chancellorsville, and they go tumbling back. So now Lee, for the last time, goes on the invasion and heads all the way up into Pennsylvania, and it, again, is straggling over here towards Gettysburg, maybe to outflank and cut off some of the big cities of the Union, Baltimore, Washington, maybe capture Harrisburg, capital of Pennsylvania, maybe Philadelphia, who knows. And this is one of the, if not the, turning point of the Civil War at the Battle of Gettysburg. On day one, you had mostly a bit of a skirmish as some of the Confederate scouts run into some Union troops, and they push the Union back through the town of Gettysburg to the hill ridge to the south of town. Again, this is where Lee, not having his cavalry to scout out the Union, seemed to hurt him. So they learn that there's fighting going on in and around Gettysburg. Lee rushes in more troops. Meade rushes in more troops. This leads to the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, where the Confederates attack all across this line, particularly in the north, trying to bend the fishhook in the north under General Ewell, and then also under Longstreet to the south and A.P. Hill trying to flank at the bottom, which is where some of the most dramatic fighting around the Little and Big Round Tops happened, which again in the film, this is very dramatically portrayed by the 20th of Maine, that holds and anchors an entire line of 100,000 men, and it's held by a few hundred men from the fisheries and farms of Maine that hold this line and maybe prevent Lee from accomplishing his greatest flanking maneuver of all that might have rolled up this entire line had they been able to gain the flank of this fishhook. That not having been accomplished, On day 3, Lee turns to General Pickett to try to break the back of the Union Army with an all-out attack in the center, right at the heart of the Union line. And it is a disaster. As the Confederate troops under General Lee are mowed down, the Union Army roars the chant of Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, that this was revenge for their own attack against a heavily entrenched high ground position, and Lee had blundered into what maybe should have been an obvious blunder. A total of 56,000 casualties. This is the bloodiest battle of the war. It takes place over the course of these 3 days and is the biggest Union victory of the war. Lee launched an all-out attack against an entrenched, numerically superior force, and the Union held their ground and broke the back of Lee's forces. Lee's army would never again be as large as it was. The Confederacy is no longer able to replace the troops that they lose here at Gettysburg. Their army will slightly continue to shrink, versus the Union armies will only continue to grow as their manpower differential really begins to show through. On almost the same day is the fall of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is among the longest sieges in world history, where General Grant forces Confederate General Pemberton to surrender and open up the Mississippi River to the Union. So Grant had tried many times. Vicksburg has many advantages for defense. It comes at this bend in the river. There's a swampland around the Yazoo River. There's the high Chickasaw Bluffs. It was very hard to attack from the north. The Big Black River flows in the Mississippi from down here, so there's no way to use it and go up the Big Black River. They've simply got to go down the Mississippi, and he can't. So he crosses to the west side, goes down the Mississippi River, cut off from his base of supply, crosses the Mississippi, and without any supply line, deciding to live off the land, he's able to fight and win several battles, including taking Jackson, Mississippi, and leave a force behind to hold it from counterattack, and then rush the rest of his army over to Vicksburg and lay siege. They lay siege for many weeks, several months, but eventually they're not able to take it by storming it. They're able to starve it into submission. And when they surrender, it's this 1-2 punch, because the Battle of Gettysburg is on July 1, 2, and 3 of 1863, and on July 4th, Vicksburg falls. It is a sucker punch and a gut punch all at once to the Confederacy. These are true Union victories. This is no draw like at Antietam. This is no small victory. These are true major Union victories. The losses the Confederates are suffering are virtually unable to be replaced. And Meade won the Battle of Gettysburg, but there are those who said that he should have counterattacked on July 4th, because Lee had been beaten so badly by his own attacking that Meade had enough men to counterattack Lee, but he was too cautious. And so Meade, even though he won the Great Battle of Gettysburg, he doesn't lose his job, but he also doesn't get promoted. Grant, who had, in the end here, proven to be the bolder and more victorious general, is promoted to command of all Union armies and is called to the Virginia Theater, to the Army of the Potomac, to be promoted over Meade, and will directly oversee the operations of Meade's army as well as all the armies. This really kills the hope for foreign recognition. With this, really the only victory condition left for the Confederacy is to make the war so costly and so bloody that the Union cannot or will not continue the war. And therefore we'll talk about both rebel and Confederate backlash politically next time. Thanks for watching.